Hello, and welcome to Emavira Audiobooks. Today's story is Book 3 in the Before You, I Was Disappearing series. 2 compasses, 1 direction, a life chosen twice. This one picks up further down the road than where we began, past the fear, past the rebuilding, into what it actually feels like when 2 people finally trust each other enough to stop protecting themselves from love. It's about distance and closeness, about the quiet difference between being needed and being trusted, and about what it means to choose someone fully a second time. Chapter 1. The Deepening. 3 years after the exhibition, Priya found herself thinking about love the way she used to think about the coastline in her work, not as a fixed line on a map, but as something that moves, season by season, through forces too slow to notice in any single week, but impossible to miss across 10 years. She and Sushant didn't fall more in love the way people describe falling in the early months of a relationship, in sudden bursts, in single, unforgettable moments. What happened instead was more like sediment settling, year after year, until the ground beneath them became solid enough to build an actual house on, though the house itself was still 18 months away from either of them saying the word out loud. She noticed the change mostly in small, everyday facts. He no longer asked "How was your day?" as a quick, polite question to get past. He asked, and then he waited, sometimes for 10 minutes, while she worked through the real shape of her day instead of just the headline. Sometime in the second year, she noticed she'd stopped doing something she still saw other women do at dinner parties, editing her own opinions half a second before saying them, silently checking whether the room could handle the full size of what she thought. With Sushant, the room could always handle it. She had simply stopped checking. "You've gotten louder," her mother told her one spring over the phone. She didn't mean it unkindly. In a good way. "You used to end your sentences like you were asking permission. You don't do that anymore." "I know," Priya said. "I noticed it too, actually. About a year ago, I was in a meeting disagreeing with a council engineer twice my age, and I heard my own voice and thought, that's not the voice I had with Rohan. That's not even quite the voice I had when I first met Sushant. That's a newer one. Where did it come from?" Priya thought about the question seriously, turning it over the way Sushant had taught her to turn things over before answering. "I think it came from 3 years of somebody actually listening to the old one," she said finally. "You don't get louder because someone tells you to be. You get louder because someone keeps proving over and over that the voice you already had was safe to use." The understanding between them had grown deeper too, mostly in the things they no longer needed to say out loud. He knew, without being told, the difference between the kind of silence that meant she was working through a problem and the sharper kind that meant she was hurting and just needed him near her, without any advice. She knew the difference between his after-a-long-day quiet, which wanted food and 40 minutes before conversation, and his quiet that meant Mira had crossed his mind, which wanted a hand on his arm and no questions at all. "I used to think closeness meant knowing everything about someone," Sushant said one evening, watching her read on the couch, her feet in his lap, a position so normal to them now that neither commented on it anymore. "I don't think that's it. I don't know everything about you. I don't need to. I know your weather. That's different, and it's better. My weather. The patterns. Not every single thought. You're allowed to keep some of those private, and so am I, but the patterns underneath. I know what a good day looks like on you and what a bad one looks like, and I know, most of the time now, what you need in either case, without you having to ask for it directly." He looked down at her, his face going still in the way it did when he'd thought carefully about something before saying it. "That took 3 years to build. I don't think it can be built any faster than that, honestly, no matter how much 2 people want it to be. Real understanding is slow. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something." She sat with that, her book forgotten in her lap. "Do you think it's finished?" "The understanding?" "No," he said. I think it's the kind of thing that keeps growing for as long as you keep paying attention. I plan to keep paying attention for a very long time. The respect between them had grown in the same slow way, not the polite respect of early dating, careful and a little performed, but something rougher and more solid, tested by 3 years of real decisions. Sushant learned to trust her completely on anything to do with the coast or the ground beneath the building, the same way she trusted him completely on structural questions. Neither of them felt smaller for it. It simply meant they had each, finally, been fully believed by someone whose belief actually meant something. I used to think respect meant being agreed with, Priya said one evening, watching him fix a mistake in a client email after she'd pointed out a technical error. No defensiveness at all, just quick, grateful correction. Rohan agreed with almost everything I said, and I never once felt respected by it, because agreeing without really engaging is just quiet absence wearing a polite face. You disagree with me all the time. And somehow the disagreeing is what makes me feel most taken seriously. That's because disagreeing means I was actually listening, Sushant said. Agreeing can be lazy. Disagreeing takes the work of understanding someone well enough to know exactly where you differ. She thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over the way she turned over most things he said, and found, as usual, that it fit. One more small brick in the long, patient structure of being fully known. What surprised her most 3 years in was how ordinary the depth felt from the inside. In her 20s, she had expected that a great love would feel dramatic, a constant, heightened awareness of how lucky she was, some kind of daily amazement. What she had instead was quieter, and she'd come to believe, much stronger. A Tuesday that felt exactly as safe as every other Tuesday, a trust so steady it had stopped feeling remarkable and had simply become the water she swam in. I don't feel amazed by you every single day, she told him once, testing whether the sentence would land the way she meant it. I want to be honest about that. Some days I just feel at home. Not fireworks. Just home. He smiled, not offended at all, completely understanding. That's the amazing part, he said. Fireworks are for people who aren't sure yet. We're past needing to be sure. We just get to be here. She thought, watching the evening light move across the yard where they'd shared hundreds of ordinary dinners, that this was probably the truest thing anyone had ever told her about love, that its deepest form doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes the ground you stand on, so steady that you eventually forget you're even standing on anything at all. The value they placed on each other showed itself, most often, in small choices nobody else would ever see. Sushant rearranged an entire quarter of Groundwork's travel schedule, without complaint, the year Priya's supervisor asked her to present at a conference in Perth on short notice, because her chance mattered just as much to him as any deadline of his own. Priya, in turn, learned to recognize the quiet that meant Sushant needed a whole weekend with no plans, no visitors, nothing but his books and his own slow thoughts. She protected those weekends fiercely, turning down even her own mother's invitations without a flicker of resentment, because she understood by then that respecting his need for solitude was its own kind of love, just as real as showing up when he was unwell. I used to think loving someone meant wanting to be around them all the time, she told Anita once over coffee. I don't think that anymore. Sometimes loving Sushant means giving him a whole Saturday of nothing, because I know that's what lets him come back to me fully present on Sunday, instead of quietly worn out. That's rarer than people think, Anita said. Knowing when to hold on and when to step back. Most couples never learn the difference. We had to learn it, Priya said. The hard way, both of us, in other relationships first. I think that's actually why it works now. We know exactly what the alternative costs. Chapter 2. When one of us is not well. The first time Sushant was truly, frighteningly unwell. Not a cold, not the mild winter flu he usually shrugged off, but a fever that climbed past 39 degrees and stayed there for 2 days, leaving him pale and unable to keep water down. Priya learned something about her own capacity to care for someone that she hadn't fully known was inside her. She moved into his Fitzroy North flat for the whole time, without even discussing it first, arriving with a bag of groceries and her laptop and the brisk confidence of a woman who had decided, the moment he texted "feel rotten, don't come over, I'll be fine," that she was coming over anyway, because fine wasn't a diagnosis she trusted from a man who had spent a decade learning to play down his own needs just to keep a household peaceful. "I told you not to come," he said weakly from the couch, as she let herself in with the key he'd given her 8 months earlier and never before had a reason to use. "I know," she said, unpacking the groceries. "I came anyway. That's how this works now. You have a site visit tomorrow." "I moved it." She filled a glass with water and electrolytes and brought it to him, sitting on the arm of the couch, checking his forehead with the back of her hand the way her own mother had done for her 1,000 times as a child. "Sushant, look at me. You don't get to manage being sick alone anymore. That's not a role either of us plays in this relationship. When you're unwell, I show up, and you let me, and neither of us apologizes for it. That's the whole deal." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes bright with fever, and something in his face cracked open in a way she rarely saw. Not weakness exactly, but the unguarded vulnerability of a man who had spent 3 years married to someone who treated his illnesses as an inconvenience to her own schedule, and who had learned, completely, to be sick alone and quietly, asking for nothing. "Mira used to leave for her mother's when I got like this," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. Not cruelly. She just wasn't good with sick people. "I learned to time my illnesses around when she'd be away anyway, so it wouldn't become a whole thing." "I'm not leaving," Priya said. "I'm not going anywhere for the next 3 days except the pharmacy. You're allowed to be sick in front of me, loudly, without dignity, asking for things. That's not a burden. That's what I'm here for." He cried a little then, not dramatically, just quiet tears at the corners of his eyes that he didn't bother hiding. She understood, without either of them saying so, that this was its own kind of milestone, a man finally unlearning the habit of performing wellness for someone who might otherwise leave. She nursed him through the worst of it with a skill that surprised even her. Cool cloths, small sips of water on a schedule, soup made from her mother's recipe, served in small portions so it wouldn't overwhelm his stomach, and long stretches, simply sitting beside him while he slept, reading with the lamp turned low so she wouldn't wake him. She was fully present, asking nothing of him except that he let himself be cared for without flinching from it. On the 3rd evening, the fever finally broke, and he woke from a long sleep to find her still there, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the couch with her laptop, quietly working through the emails she'd let pile up. "You've been here this whole time," he said, his voice still rough. "Where else would I be?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Some part of me kept expecting you to reach a limit. Some point where being needed this much would become too much, and you'd need space, and I'd understand, because that's what I've always understood before." She closed the laptop and moved to sit properly beside him, taking his hand, still faintly warm. "There isn't a limit, Sushant. I need you to actually believe that, not just hear it. Taking care of you when you're sick isn't a cost I'm putting up with. It's not a debt you'll owe me later. It's just what loving someone means in practice on the hard days. I'd want the same from you, and you've already proven, many small times, that I'd get it." She was right. 8 months later, when her own body finally caught up with 2 years of built-up tiredness, a case of pneumonia that put her in the hospital for 3 days, More frightening than anything they'd faced together before, Sushant didn't leave her side, except when the hospital rules required it. He learned the names of her medications before the doctor had even finished explaining them. He sat through the longest, most frightening night of the illness, holding her hand and reading aloud, quietly, from the novel they'd been reading together on their Wednesday evenings, his voice steady even though, she learned much later, his own chest had been tight with fear he hadn't let her see. "I wasn't going to let you see that," he admitted afterward. Once she was home and resting on the couch with tea he'd made exactly the way she liked it. "You needed calm, not my fear on top of your fever. There would be time for my fear later, privately, and there was. I sat in your hospital car park for 20 minutes on the second night and just breathed because I couldn't hold it together for one more minute and didn't want you to see me not holding it together. You could have told me." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you now. That's different from hiding it forever. I just needed you well first." She reached for his hand, still weak but steady enough to hold him properly. "This is the part nobody warns you about," she said. "Not falling in love. This. Being frightened for someone and staying anyway. Caring for someone through the worst of themselves and never once resenting the hours it costs you." She looked at him, feeling the full weight of what 5 years had actually built between them. "I don't think I understood before you that this is what real love actually costs and that the cost isn't a flaw in it. It's the proof." "The proof," he agreed, and kissed her forehead, gentle and warm, and neither of them needed to say anything else for a long while. It wasn't only sickness that taught them this. There were harder months too, a stretch, 18 months into the business, when a project Priya had spent a whole year on fell apart because of a council funding cut that had nothing to do with the quality of her work and everything to do with politics she couldn't control. She came home completely deflated, in a way that frightened her a little, an old familiar hollowness she recognized from her worst months with Rohan. Sushant didn't try to fix it. By then, he had learned the difference between a problem that needed solving and a grief that simply needed to be witnessed, and he sat with her on the couch for 3 straight evenings, saying very little, making sure she ate, making sure she slept, never once suggesting she should be over it faster than she was. "I keep thinking I should be stronger than this," she admitted on the 3rd night. "It's just a project. Nobody died. You're allowed to grieve something you put a year of your life into," he said. "Strength isn't the absence of this feeling. It's letting yourself feel it fully instead of pretending you don't." He pulled her closer. "I'm not going anywhere while you find your way through it. There's no schedule you owe me for how fast that has to happen." She recovered, in time, the way she always did, but she recovered inside a relationship that had never once asked her to hide the recovering. Watching him make tea in the next room, calm and completely present, she understood that this too was its own kind of care, as real as any cool cloth on a fevered forehead, the willingness to sit inside someone else's low season without trying to rush them out of it. The care between them reached beyond just the two of them, in time. When Priya's grandmother had a bad fall the year before her 90th birthday, breaking her hip in a way that would never fully heal, Sushant didn't treat it as belonging only to Priya's family, something to worry about from a polite distance. He drove her to Dandenong that same evening, sat in hospital hallways through the worst of the uncertainty, and kept coming back, again and again over the following months, without being asked, simply because he had come to think of her grandmother as his own responsibility too. "You don't have to keep coming," Priya told him gently, after his 4th visit in 2 weeks, moved and a little overwhelmed by how naturally he'd taken on her family's crisis as his own. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. She matters to you, which makes her matter to me. That's not a favor I'm doing you, Priya. That's just what it means to actually belong to a family, even one you didn't marry into on paper." Her grandmother, sharp-eyed even from a hospital bed, noticed exactly what was happening, and said as much to Priya one afternoon while Sushant fetched tea from the corridor machine. "That one," she said in Hindi, nodding toward the door, "doesn't perform kindness. He simply has it. Your grandfather was the same. I would know." It was, Priya thought later, one of the highest compliments her grandmother had ever given anyone, and she carried it with her a long time afterward. The quiet, growing certainty that the love she and Sushant had built wasn't a private matter contained to just their two lives, but something that had, patiently and without ceremony, grown large enough to hold their families too. Chapter 3. What growing a business actually grows. Groundwork turned 2 years old that spring, and by then it had grown into something neither of them had quite dared to imagine when they were crouched in the sand beside that old boat shed, a small but genuinely respected practice, for completed studies behind them, and a waiting list of counsel and community inquiries that had started to outpace what two people working around their day jobs could reasonably handle. Leaving their salaried jobs hadn't been an easy decision, or a fast one, and it wasn't made separately. It took most of 8 months of spreadsheets at the kitchen table, Sushant modeling 3 years of careful cash flow with the same care he once brought to lentils, Priya checking every assumption against the real work she could see coming. "We could fail," she said, on the night they finally sat down to decide for certain, the notebook, now on its 3rd volume, open between them. "I want to say that plainly, not as a fear to manage away, but as a real possibility we're choosing to risk." "We could," Sushant agreed. "I've run the numbers 11 different ways, and in 2 of them we fail within 18 months and have to go back to salaried work, a bit poorer and a lot wiser." He looked at her steadily. "I'm still voting yes. Not because I'm certain we'll succeed. Because I'm certain I'd rather fail at something we built together than keep succeeding at something that was never really ours." She reached across the table and took his hand, feeling in that moment everything the business had quietly taught them for 2 years. That risk shared honestly, between two people who trust each other's judgment and respect each other's fear, is a completely different thing than risk carried alone. They both gave notice within the same month. When Priya told her, Anita simply nodded, unsurprised, and said, "I've been waiting for this conversation for a year. Send me your rates when you're ready. The council has 3 more sites just like your boat shed, and I'd rather you had them than anyone else." What surprised Priya most, in the first year of groundwork running full-time, wasn't the hard parts, the invoicing, the occasional client who didn't understand the value of what they offered, the long stretches of proposal writing that produced nothing visible right away. It was how much working alongside Sushant, properly, full-time, showed her sides of him she hadn't fully seen even after 3 years of loving him. She watched him negotiate a contract with a difficult developer, patient and precise, never once raising his voice, calmly taking apart a bad faith argument with the same steadiness he brought to explaining cumin seeds. She watched him mentor a young engineer they'd hired part-time, generous with his knowledge in a way that had nothing performed about it, simply the quiet passing on of skill from someone who clearly remembered what it felt like to be new and unsure. "You're a genuinely excellent boss," she told him, watching him walk their young associate through a structural review with endless, unhurried patience. "I don't think I knew that about you. I knew you were kind to me. I didn't fully know you'd be this kind, this consistently, to someone with no reason to expect it. Kindness that only shows up for the person you're sleeping with isn't actually kindness," he said, only half joking. "It's just strategy. I'd rather be the real thing." He, in turn, watched her run client meetings with a backbone she hadn't fully owned even a year earlier, holding firm on scope, explaining complex ideas to doubtful council members in language that made them lean in instead of tune out, closing a hard negotiation with a confidence that made him, more than once, simply sit back in his chair and watch her with open admiration. "You built that room," he told her once, after she'd talked a hesitant client into their biggest job yet. "I watched you build it, sentence by sentence. I don't think you know how good you've become at this." "I had a good teacher in confidence," she said. "You had a good partner," he corrected gently. "The confidence was always yours. I just kept insisting you stop apologizing for it." The project that finally proved, beyond any private doubt either of them still carried, that leaving their salaried jobs had been the right choice, came in the shape of a state government tender, a coastal heritage area threatened by both rising water and years of council neglect, bigger than anything groundwork had attempted before, the kind of contract that could either properly establish them or stretch their small, young practice past its limits. They argued briefly and honestly about whether to even bid. Sushant worried, as always, about whether two people and two part-time associates could deliver work of this size and quality without burning out completely. Priya worried less about capacity and more about ambition, whether they were letting fear of failure quietly disguise itself as caution. "We built this practice to do exactly this kind of work," she said, laying the tender papers across the kitchen table. "If we don't bid because we're scared of the size of it, we're doing the exact thing we promised each other we wouldn't do, playing small to feel safe." "I'm not scared of the size of it," Sushant said carefully. "I'm scared of promising a government department something we can't deliver and damaging everything we've built trying to prove a point to ourselves." They sat with a disagreement for 2 full days, testing it from every angle the way they tested everything important, before landing together on a middle path that satisfied both instincts. They would bid, but carefully, keeping the scope tight enough that even a worst-case outcome wouldn't break them, and hiring a third associate specifically to help manage the extra work. They won the tender 4 months later, and delivered it, over the following 18 months, to a standard that earned Groundwork its first real industry recognition, a State Heritage Award, given at a ceremony in the city that neither of them expected to feel as moving as it did, standing together on a small stage accepting something they had built, quite literally, from a derelict boat shed and complete faith in each other's ability. "We could have played it safe and never bid," Sushant said afterward, holding the modest glass trophy, turning it over in his hands with something like disbelief. "I'm glad we didn't listen to my fear on this one." "I'm glad we listened to both of us," Priya said. "That's the actual formula, I think. Not ignoring the fear. Weighing it properly against the ambition, together, until you land somewhere honest." By the second year full-time, Groundwork had grown enough to need a small rented office above a bakery in Northcote, 3 associates now, and a rhythm that let them, for the first time in either of their adult lives, shape their days entirely around work that mattered to them and hours that belonged, afterward, entirely to their own life together. They kept, on purpose, the same limits that had protected their relationship from the start, her Tuesdays, his Thursday pool nights, easier to protect now that they set their own schedule, and added one new rule specific to the business. No work talk after 7 in the evening, a rule they broke sometimes and always noticed when they had, correcting course the way they'd learned to correct most things, gently, without either needing to be right about it. "I used to think building something together would be the risky part," Priya said one evening, locking up the office for the night, the smell of tomorrow's bread already faintly rising through the floor. "The part that could actually hurt us if it went wrong. And now I think it's been the opposite. It's taught me more about how well we actually work together than 3 years of just living side by side ever could. There's nowhere to hide in a shared spreadsheet, Sushant. You either trust someone with your real judgment or you don't. I trust you with mine completely. I don't think I've ever said that about anyone else, in any way, in my whole life." He locked the office door, took her hand on the stairs down to the street, and said simply, "Same. Completely. Every single day of it." Leaving their salary jobs had done something else too. something neither had fully expected. It gave their hobbies room to breathe in a way a 50-hour workweek never had. Sushant set aside 2 mornings a week, no exceptions, for the long-promised follow-up to his Heritage Walk history book, and Priya made sure every one of those mornings stayed protected, rerouting client calls without being asked. Priya, in turn, started teaching a small evening class on coastal drawing at the local community center, something she'd wanted to do for years and never had the spare hours for. Sushant came to the first session just to sit at the back and watch her teach, unable to hide the pride on his face. "You don't have to keep coming," she told him, amused, after the 3rd week. "I know," he said. "I want to. Watching you do something you love, well, in front of people lucky enough to learn from you. That's not a chore, Priya. That might be one of my favorite ways to spend a Tuesday evening. It's supposed to be my hobby." "It became mine too," he said, "the moment I understood how much it lit you up. That's not me taking it from you. That's just what happens when you love someone properly. Their joy stops feeling separate from yours." Chapter 4. The Year They Divided the World. The idea of a year of travel had been circling both of them for over a year before either one said it out loud. The quiet luxury of a business finally stable enough to run partly without them, associates trusted enough to hold things together, and 2 people who had spent 3 years learning, patiently, exactly how well their different interests worked together instead of competing. "I want you to pick half the places," Sushant said, the night they finally sat down with a world map spread across the kitchen table, a glass of wine each, both of them excited about starting something big on purpose. "Not places you think I'd like. Places you actually want for yourself, no matter what I think." "That feels backwards," Priya said. "Shouldn't we plan it together, place by place?" "We will, in the sense that we're doing it together, and neither of us goes anywhere the other doesn't want to be part of. But I want half the trip to come from your curiosity and half from mine, without watering it down, so that when we're standing somewhere neither of us has been, we're each seeing it partly through the other's eyes, instead of some flattened, compromised version of both." He smiled. "I learned that from you, actually. Respecting the whole shape of someone instead of asking them to shrink to fit a shared plan." They divided the year, roughly, into his list and her list, each choosing 5 destinations with freedom to explain why, and the other listening without editing. Sushant's list surprised her less than she expected, and delighted her more than she'd guessed. Finland in deep winter, for the northern lights and the strange, otherworldly quiet of a landscape under permanent snow, a boyhood fascination he'd never had reason to follow up on. The salt flats of Bolivia, for the mirror sky effect he'd seen once in a photography magazine as a student and never forgotten. 2 weeks in the old parts of Istanbul and Cairo, following the architecture he'd spent a career admiring only in books, and unexpectedly, a slow month in rural Japan, drawn by the country's special relationship with craftsmanship and impermanence, an idea he said he'd been circling his whole adult life, without knowing its name. Priya's list looked different. The fjords of Norway, for the huge scale of landscape she'd studied at university and never actually stood inside. 3 weeks moving slowly through the coastal towns of Portugal and Spain, sketching harbor buildings the way she'd once sketched the Australian coast. A season in New Zealand's South Island, hiking country she'd heard colleagues describe for a decade, and finishing the list with something that made Sushant go quiet and then smile slowly. A full 6 weeks in India, planned deliberately across 3 different regions rather than just one. "I want to see all of it properly," she said, explaining that last choice. "Not just the version of India you get at a wedding or a quick family visit. I want the South, Kerala's waterways, the Tamil temple towns. I want the North again, properly, not just passing through Delhi, the mountains, Rajasthan's forts. I want the East too, Kolkata and the hills beyond it, places neither of our families ever took us." She looked at him. You've spent 12 years walking Melbourne, reading its history in brick and old woodwork. I want to read India the same way, at the same pace, before I'm too old to walk it properly. Sushant reached across the table and took her hand. I'll walk every mile of it with you, he said. It's my root country too, in a different direction than yours. I'd like to finally see the parts of it I only ever visited as a child, too distracted to really notice what I was looking at. They spent the year exactly as they'd planned it, though of course not exactly as either had imagined. Travel rarely goes fully to plan, even the most careful one. Finland's northern lights appeared only on the third of 5 nights, but the 2 nights of waiting, wrapped in blankets on a frozen lake with thermoses of coffee, talking quietly under a sky just starting to show color, turned out, both later agreed, to be more memorable than the lights themselves. Bolivia's salt flats gave them one perfect sunset that no photo or memory could ever quite capture. The whole sky doubled beneath their feet, the 2 of them standing in the exact center of a mirrored infinity, saying almost nothing because there was almost nothing that felt adequate to say. I keep thinking, Priya said, standing in that impossible reflected sky, Sushant's hand in hers, that 6 years ago, I thought my whole life was a flat in Richmond that looked good in photos. And now look where looking good has actually taken me. Somewhere real, Sushant said. That's the difference. Richmond photographed like a life. This is one. Throughout the year, they kept the habits that had carried them through everything else, his morning walks turning into explorations of whatever city they woke up in, her sketchbook filling steadily with harbor towns and temple fronts, both cameras working overtime, the shared notebook growing thick with new entries in 2 different hands. Even after a year of near-constant company, each of them still kept a private hour most mornings before the day properly began. I thought a whole year of this much togetherness might finally test the parts of us that need to be apart, Sushant admitted, somewhere around month 8, in a quiet guest house in rural Japan. I don't think it has. If anything, it's shown me we're better at protecting that separateness than I gave us credit for. You still disappear with your sketchbook for an hour most mornings. I still take my walk alone. We've just done it in 40 different countries instead of one Northcote flat. The habit was never really about the flat, Priya said. It was about knowing we're each still whole people, even standing this close together, for this long, this happily. Istanbul and Cairo gave Sushant weeks of exactly the kind of architecture he'd been reading about since he was a student. Mosques and old neighborhoods layered with centuries, he could read the way other people read a newspaper. More than once, Priya found herself watching him instead of the buildings, delighted by how completely he lost himself in joy when he stood in front of something old enough to hold real history. New Zealand South Island, on the other hand, gave Priya 9 days of hiking that properly tested them both, glacier valleys and high mountain passes that made the Grampians look easy by comparison. On the 4th of those days, exhausted and happy on a ridge above Lake Wanaka, Sushant admitted, laughing, that he had underestimated exactly how much stamina 5 years with her had built in him. I couldn't have done a day like today when we met, he said, catching his breath at the top of a climb that had taken most of the morning. Not just my legs. All of me. I didn't know yet how to keep pushing toward something difficult and still enjoy it, instead of just grimly enduring it until it was over. You've gotten better at hard things, Priya agreed. So have I. I think that's what this whole year has actually been, training underneath all the sightseeing. Not our legs. Our ability to keep choosing difficulty together and finding it worthwhile. The last week of the year, before flying home to Melbourne, they spent quietly back in Portugal, deliberately returning to the small coastal town where they'd had their argument about a missed train, both agreeing without much discussion that they wanted to close the year exactly where a part of it had nearly gone wrong, and prove to themselves how far they'd come since. They sat at the same harborside cafe, ordered the same simple meal, and Sushant raised his glass with a small, private smile. "To the missed train," he said. "Honestly, the best thing that happened to us all year. It taught us we could survive being genuinely frustrated with each other and come out closer for it." "To the missed train," Priya agreed, clinking her glass against his. "And to everything after it. Finland's lights. That impossible sky in Bolivia. My grandfather's grave, finally visited. Every mountain, every argument, every quiet morning with a sketchbook." She looked at him, feeling the whole weight of the year settle into something like gratitude too big for one sentence. "I don't think I could have imagined, 6 years ago, that a year like this was even possible for me. Not the traveling. The person beside me while I did it." "Same," Sushant said simply, reaching for her hand across the small cafe table, the Atlantic light falling gold over both of them, 1 year and a whole world behind them, and an entire unwritten life still ahead. They ended the India leg with a week in Dandenong, staying with Priya's parents before flying on to the next continent. Over her father's careful spice heating and her mother's insistence on feeding Sushant until he could barely move, Priya's father pulled her aside quietly on the last evening. "He came back different from that trip," her father said, nodding toward the garden, where Sushant was showing Meenakshi photos from Delhi on his phone, both of them laughing at something. "Lighter. I don't know exactly what happened over there, and it's not mine to ask. But I see it in how he carries himself now." "He visited his uncle's grave," Priya said quietly. 12 years too late, but he finally went." Her father nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. "That's a good thing to walk someone through," he said. "Not everyone gets a partner who'll walk them back to the hard places, not just the easy ones." He squeezed her shoulder. "You've done well, Beta. Both of you have." Chapter 5. Returning to the route. The India part of the year came in the 9th month, 6 weeks planned exactly as Priya wanted it, south first, then east, then finally north, tracing a slow line across the country that neither of them had ever walked with this much care before. Kerala unfolded around them in green and water, houseboats drifting the backwaters at the same slow pace as their biking Sundays back in Melbourne, Priya sketching the traditional wooden boats with the same hungry attention she'd once given the old boat shed at Point Lonsdale, Sushant photographing Temple Towers with a stillness that told her, without words, that he had found something here that mattered to him in a way deeper than simple tourism. "I never came south as a child," he told her, standing in the vast stone quiet of a Tamil temple town, incense and centuries settling around them. "My family story was always north, Delhi, the Punjab side of things. I didn't know until this trip that half of what I love about old buildings I could have found here the whole time, if anyone had thought to bring me. Then I'm glad I got to be the one who did," Priya said, and meant it completely. They moved east after that, Kolkata's crumbling old colonial buildings, which Sushant photographed with the same deep respect he gave Melbourne's faded old signs, and then up into the hills beyond, tea country unfolding green and cool after weeks of hot, humid plains, where they walked for 4 days through a landscape that reminded neither of them of anywhere else they'd been. "This is what I wanted," Priya said, on a ridge overlooking a valley of tea gardens, the light turning gold just as it had over the fern gullies at Wilson's Prom on their very first camping trip together. Not just the version of India you get at a wedding or a family visit. The actual size of it. The parts that don't belong to anyone's family story specifically, that are just the country, offering itself, if you're willing to walk far enough to see it. The north came last, and it came heaviest because it meant Delhi, Sushant's actual childhood, streets he had last walked as an 11-year-old boy before his family slowly moved toward Melbourne, an earlier version of himself he had rarely talked about even to Priya in 3 years of otherwise complete honesty. He was quieter in Delhi than she had ever seen him, not unhappy, but carrying the weight of a man walking through his own dug-up history. He found the ridge roads he'd once cycled with his uncle, mostly changed beyond recognition, one stretch near a park still, surprisingly, exactly as he remembered it. He stood there a long time while Priya waited a few steps behind, giving him the space she had learned over 3 years to offer without being asked. "My uncle died 4 years ago," he said finally, without turning around. "I didn't go back for the funeral. Mira didn't want to make the trip, and by then I'd stopped fighting for the things that mattered to me, and I've regretted it every year since." He turned to face her, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she rarely saw even now. "I want to visit his grave while we're here. I haven't done it. 12 years, and I haven't done it." The next morning, they went together to a quiet cemetery on the edge of the city. Priya stood a respectful distance back while Sushant knelt at a simple stone and spoke quietly in Hindi she only partly understood, but felt completely, an apology, she gathered, for the years of absence, and something in his tone that sounded like gratitude. He cried properly there, for the first time she had seen in 3 years, not the quiet tears of his fever, but full, shaking grief, 12 years of it arriving all at once. She knelt beside him and held him, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. This was exactly the kind of care they had learned, slowly and carefully, over 3 years of practice. Showing up, staying, offering nothing but presence, and trusting that presence was enough. "Thank you for bringing me back here," he said eventually, his voice rough, once the worst of it had passed. "I don't think I'd have come on my own. I don't think I'd have let myself." "You would have eventually," Priya said gently. "I just made it easier to stop putting it off." Rajasthan came next, lighter, the forts and painted cities Priya had dreamed of for years. Both of them recovered enough by then to enjoy it fully. Camel rides at sunset, Sushant photographing sandstone buildings with his full attention restored, Priya sketching until her hand ached. 6 weeks of route country travel settled slowly into both of them, the way good soil settles around something planted to last. "I understand something now I didn't understand before this trip," Sushant said, on their last night in India, sitting on a rooftop in Jaipur with the old city glowing amber below them. "Roots aren't just where you're from. They're what you finally let yourself feel fully, instead of managing around. I spent 12 years managing around mine. You gave me 6 weeks to just feel them instead." "That's what this whole year has been," Priya said, leaning into him. "Not escaping our lives. Finally feeling the whole size of them." Chapter 6. The Fights That Didn't Break Anything. It would be untrue, Priya thought often in the years that followed, to describe those 3 years, the growing closeness, the business, the year of travel, as completely without conflict. They argued. Of course they argued. They were two whole, opinionated, sometimes exhausted adults building a life and a business and, eventually, a house together, and anyone who claims otherwise about a relationship this full is either lying or describing something much shallower. What made the real difference, she came to understand, wasn't the lack of friction. It was what they did with it. There was a real fight in Portugal, 7 months into the travel year, over something that didn't matter at all looking back, a missed train, an argument about how much of the coastal town to see before moving on. Both of them tired in the thin-skinned way long travel eventually makes even people who love each other completely. Sushant had gone quiet in the old way, the way he used to before Priya, a tight, managed silence that made her chest tighten with an old, unrelated fear before she caught herself and named what was actually happening. "You're doing the thing," she said that evening, in their small rented room above the harbor. "The old thing." going quiet instead of telling me you're frustrated." He stopped halfway through folding a shirt and looked at her with something like surprise at being caught. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I am." He sat down on the edge of the bed. "I'm frustrated that we missed the train because I was slow packing, and I'm embarrassed about it, and the old me would have just quietly absorbed the embarrassment until it turned into something else entirely." "The new you gets to just say it," Priya said, sitting beside him. "I was frustrated too, for what it's worth. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to tell me when you're not, so I'm not left guessing at a silence." They talked it through properly, not a long conversation, 20 minutes at most, and by the end of it, they were laughing gently at how much energy the missed train had cost them compared to how little it actually mattered. "This is the part nobody puts in the postcards," Sushant said. "The boring, unglamorous work of two people staying honest with each other instead of pretending to be in a good mood for the sake of the trip." "I like this part best, actually," Priya said. "It's proof we're not just performing happiness for each other. We're actually building it one small argument at a time and choosing every time to talk instead of shut down." There was one disagreement, midway through the travel year, that cut deeper than a missed train, a scheduling clash between a family event on Sushant's side and one on Priya's, both falling in the same narrow week, forcing a choice neither wanted to make. He wanted to keep a promise to attend a cousin's wedding in Delhi. She had committed, just as firmly, to being home for her grandmother's 90th birthday in Melbourne, a trip neither of them had planned for. "I can't be in two places," Priya said, frustrated for the first time in months, an old fear rising that a conflict this real might actually cost them something. "And I don't want either of us to feel like we came second." "Then we don't choose between us," Sushant said, after a long, careful pause. "We split up. I go to Delhi. You fly home for your grandmother. We lose 4 days of being in the same country, and that's genuinely disappointing, but it's not a crisis. It's just two people with full lives outside this relationship and the schedule catching up with us." In the moment, it felt like a small defeat, the first time all year they wouldn't wake up in the same bed. But 4 days apart, each fully present for the people who needed them, taught them both something they hadn't expected, that missing each other sharply, briefly, for a good reason, is its own kind of proof. They reunited in Mumbai a week later, and the reunion itself, as ordinary as it was, felt like one of the most romantic mornings of the whole year, not because of any big gesture, but because both of them had chosen, freely, to be fully present somewhere else first, and had come back wanting each other exactly as much as before. "I was worried, before this trip, that loving you this much would eventually mean smaller lives outside of it," Priya admitted in the airport arrivals hall, holding him tightly. "This week proved the opposite. We can still show up fully for the people who need us. That doesn't threaten this at all." "It never will," Sushant said. "Not with you." Looking back on those years later, Priya came to understand that communication itself had become, quietly, the one skill they had both worked hardest at building. Harder in some ways than the business, harder than the travel logistics, harder even than learning to cook. It wasn't a talent either of them started with. It was a habit, practiced daily, the way Sushant practiced his swimming or she practiced her drawing, small, deliberate repetitions that eventually became instinct. Early on, they had made an unspoken rule that neither of them ever fully put into words until years later, over a quiet dinner. Never let the sun go down on a real complaint left unspoken. Not a strict rule to resolve everything before sleep, which they both knew could force a fake peace onto a conversation that needed more time, but a commitment to at least name what was wrong before the day ended, so it never had the chance to harden into silence. "I think that's the real secret," Sushant said, turning his wine glass slowly, watching the last light fade over their garden. "Not never fighting. Never letting a fight grow bigger than the words it would take to end it. Every single disagreement we've ever had could have been solved by one honest conversation. We just had to keep choosing to have it instead of retreating. Rohan and I could go a whole week without really talking, Priya said quietly. Just logistics. Just surface stuff. I used to think that was normal. I know now it was just two people who'd stopped believing the other one would actually listen. I believe you'll listen, Sushant said. Every single time. That's not nothing, Priya. That might be the whole foundation everything else stands on. Chapter 7. The question neither of them asked first. They came home from the year of travel to two separate flats that suddenly, for the first time in 5 years of being together, felt slightly wrong. Not because anything between them had changed, but because everything had, and the two homes that once represented exactly the right amount of space now felt, quietly, like an old arrangement neither of them had thought to update. Priya noticed it first in small, everyday moments. Standing in her own Northcote kitchen, cooking for one because Sushant was at his own flat catching up on emails, she found herself missing him with an intensity that surprised her. Not the normal missing of a partner who'd be back in a day or two, but something closer to feeling incomplete, a feeling she uneasily connected to the dependent, hollowed-out version of herself she used to be with Rohan. It took her several days of careful, honest thinking to tell the two feelings apart. It's not the same, she finally told herself, sitting with a feeling instead of pushing it away. Missing someone you trust completely, whose absence doesn't threaten who you are, is not the same as the anxious grasping I felt when I was disappearing into someone who didn't see me. This isn't fear. This is just wanting to be near someone I love, plainly, without the old wound coloring it. She said nothing to Sushant for almost 3 weeks, turning the feeling over carefully, testing it against everything she'd learned about herself since Rohan, because she was genuinely afraid in a way she hadn't felt since the earliest, most fragile days of the relationship, that bringing up living together might land the wrong way. That Sushant, who had told her so plainly in that gallery 3 years earlier that he needed his own address, his own unshared furniture, might hear a request to move in as a request to give up the very independence he'd fought so hard to win back from Mira. That she might, without meaning to, become the person asking him to shrink again. Sushant, without knowing it, was carrying an almost identical fear in the opposite direction. He too had noticed missing her with equal intensity, coming home to his Fitzroy North flat after a long day at the office, the quiet that used to feel like safety now feeling, more and more, like loneliness, a fact that alarmed him slightly, given how hard he'd fought for exactly this kind of independent quiet in the years after his divorce. More and more, he found himself simply going to her place instead of his own, staying later, leaving later, until the pattern became so steady that his own address started to feel like a formality rather than a home. He too said nothing for weeks, held back by a fear that mirrored hers almost exactly, though he didn't know it yet. That Priya, who had built her whole post-divorce identity around never again disappearing into someone else's rooms, around the specific dignity of her own address, her own name on her own lease, might hear an offer to live together as an erasing of exactly the independence she'd fought hardest to win back. That he might, without meaning to, become the person asking her to shrink. The truth finally came out on an ordinary Sunday evening, for weeks after they got home, both of them tired from a long week of catching groundwork back up after a year away, sitting together at her kitchen table over the leftovers of a meal neither had fully finished. "Can I tell you something that's been sitting in my chest for weeks?" Priya said, and heard her own voice shake slightly, which surprised her, because she hadn't cried in front of him over anything this small in over a year. "Always," he said, setting down his fork, giving her his full attention, the way she'd come to rely on completely. "I think I want to live together," she said, the words coming out faster than planned, as if speed might make the fear smaller. I've thought about it for weeks. I haven't said anything because I was scared, really scared, Sushant, in the old way, the way I promised myself I'd try not to be scared with you, that you'd hear it as me asking you to give up the flat you fought so hard to keep. I don't want to be that. I never want to be the person who makes you smaller to make me more comfortable. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something complicated move across his face, and then, slowly, unexpectedly, he began to laugh, a soft, disbelieving sound, nothing like the reaction she'd braced herself for. "What?" she said. "What's funny?" "I've had the exact same conversation with myself for 3 weeks," he said. "Word for word, almost. I go home to an empty flat every night now, and it doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like missing you. And I haven't said anything because I was terrified you'd hear it as me asking you to give up your own independence, your own address, the thing you rebuilt yourself around after Rohan. I didn't want to be the person who made you smaller either." They looked at each other across the table, the leftovers forgotten, both of them starting to laugh now, the relieved laughter of two people who had each been protecting the other from a fear that turned out never to be real. "We've been circling the exact same conversation," Priya said, each too afraid to start it, for the exact same reason, in opposite directions. "We're ridiculous," Sushant said, still laughing, reaching for her hand across the table. "Genuinely, completely ridiculous. 5 years of learning to say hard things to each other, and we still managed to sit on this one for a whole month." "So say it now," Priya said, steadying herself. "Properly. I want to hear you say it, not just agree with mine." He grew quiet again, but differently this time. The stillness she recognized as him gathering something important, not retreating from it. "I'm ready to live with you," he said plainly, holding her eyes. "Not because the 2 flats failed. They didn't. They did exactly what we needed them to do, for exactly as long as we needed it. But I don't need that particular kind of protection anymore, Priya. I spent years afraid that closeness meant disappearing, because that's what it meant with Mira. It doesn't mean that with you. It never once has. I know that now, completely, the way you only know something after enough years of testing it. I don't want a smaller version of you in my life. I want the whole size of you, every day, in the same rooms. I need you, plainly, without any conditions. I'm done needing a separate address to prove I'm still myself. I already know I'm still myself with you. You've never once asked me to be anything else." Something in Priya's chest let go completely, the last small knot of the old fear, the one that had followed her out of her marriage and quietly, patiently waited 5 years to finally dissolve. "I need you too," she said. "The same way. Completely, no conditions. I'm ready too. I've been ready longer than I let myself admit, actually, because admitting it felt like a risk I wasn't sure I was allowed to take." "You're allowed," Sushant said, coming around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands. "You're allowed to want this," loudly, without checking first whether it's permitted. "I'm asking you properly, Priya. Not to marry me. We've already agreed we don't need that particular piece of paper to make this real. I'm asking you to build an actual home with me. One address. One life. Finally, without the careful arrangement of 2. Because I'm ready. Because you've never once made me feel unsafe enough to need the distance. Because 5 years of learning each other has taught me exactly what I already suspected in the first year, that I want to spend the rest of my life exactly this close to you." "Yes," Priya said, before he'd even finished, both of them laughing again through something very close to tears. "Yes. Completely. Let's build something we both actually live inside." They called their mothers separately that same night, still giddy, still a little amazed at how simple the whole conversation had turned out to be, after a month of silent, mirrored fear. Meenakshi's reaction was warm and immediate, No trace left of her old worry about paperwork and roofs. "Finally," she said, laughing. "I could have told you both this a year ago, but you two always did need to arrive at things in your own time." Sushant's mother, on the phone from Delhi, was quieter, more careful, in her usual way, but Priya, listening from across the room, watched his face soften as he listened and understood, just from his expression, that whatever his mother said had landed exactly right. "She said she's glad I finally stopped being afraid of my own life," he told Priya afterward, setting the phone down. "She said it took her son long enough to learn that safety isn't something you find by staying small. I didn't expect that from her, honestly. I think 5 years of watching us, mostly from a distance, taught her something too." Chapter 8. Groundbreaking. They chose a piece of land on the Bellarine Peninsula, 20 minutes from the boat shed that had started the business, close enough to the coast to smell salt on the right kind of evening wind, but far enough back from the erosion line that Priya, using 5 years of her own professional knowledge, had personally checked the site before either of them let themselves fall in love with it. "I'm not building us a dream house on land I haven't checked myself," she said, laughing, the first time Sushant teased her about running a full coastal risk study on their own future backyard. "It's an occupational hazard. I refuse to be the professional who tells other people to check their foundations and doesn't check her own." "I wouldn't want you any other way," he said, and meant it completely. They designed the house together over about 6 months, in evenings that felt, to both of them, like an extension of everything else they'd built. The shared notebook was retired to a shelf, replaced by an architect's sketch pad they filled together, Priya's professional hand steadying Sushant's more instinctive, feeling-led ideas, each of them deferring to the other's skill exactly where it belonged and standing firm exactly where their own mattered. The house that came out of this was clearly a record of everything they had learned about each other over 5 years. A small gym, because Sushant's Thursday pool nights had grown, over time, into a wider commitment to properly taking care of his body, something Priya had never once pushed him toward and had simply, steadily, made room for. A quiet lap pool along the north side, angled to catch the afternoon sun. A generous master bathroom with a deep jacuzzi tub, because Priya had confessed, early in their relationship, a private, slightly embarrassed love of long baths that Rohan had always treated as a wasteful indulgence, and Sushant had never once let her forget that her small pleasures deserved proper space. Priya's study took up the north corner of the upper floor, floor-to-ceiling shelves for the books that had, over the years, become as much his collection as hers, a wide drafting table by the window, room enough for the sketchbooks and site plans of a working practice showing no signs of slowing down. Sushant had insisted on the size of it before she'd even finished describing what she needed. "You spent 6 years with a study that was really just a corner of someone else's office," he said, looking over the plans. "You get the good corner of this house. That's not up for discussion." Priya, in turn, had insisted on an equal space for him, a smaller workshop room off the garage, properly ventilated and lit, where his grandfather's old camera and the darkroom equipment they'd been squeezing into bathrooms for years could finally live permanently, along with a long bench for the historical research he was, by then, 3 chapters into his second book about. "You don't have to fight me on this one," he said, when she first brought it up. "I wasn't going to ask for it. I'd have made do with a corner somewhere." "I know you would have," Priya said. "That's exactly why I'm insisting. You spent a decade making do with corners, Sushant, in a marriage that never once thought your work deserved proper space. I'm not building a house where that happens again, even by accident, even because you're too used to not asking." He went quiet for a moment, the particular quiet she now recognized as him absorbing something that moved him more than he had words ready for. "Nobody's ever built me a room before," he said finally. "Not like this. Not on purpose, specifically shaped around what I actually love." "Get used to it," she said, echoing, without quite meaning to, words he had once said to her in a different moment. That's what the whole rest of this house is going to be. Two people, building each other proper rooms, instead of asking each other to fit into someone else's. The workshop, once finished, became one of his favorite places in the whole house. Hours spent developing film, taking notes on his research, occasionally just sitting with a cup of tea among his grandfather's tools. Priya would find him there some evenings, completely absorbed, and would simply lean in the doorway a moment, watching, before leaving him to it, understanding by then exactly how much a room built with someone in mind could say, what words sometimes couldn't. The heart of the design, though, the piece they'd both sketched first, before anything else, on the same evening they chose the block of land, was the master bedroom's balcony. Wide, deep enough for proper furniture rather than an afterthought, facing west and slightly south, positioned with a precision that took Sushant 3 separate visits to the empty block, compass in hand, his grandfather's compass, the same one he'd given her at Sealer's Cove, checking angles against a full year of sun and moon charts he'd researched with his usual thoroughness. "I want us to be able to watch the sunset from bed on the nights we're too tired to move," he explained, showing her his calculations. "And I checked the moon path, too. Full moon rises almost exactly over that line of trees to the east most months. I want us to be able to sit out there and watch both, the sun going and the moon coming, without having to go anywhere or plan anything. Just step outside." Priya looked at the careful diagrams, at the months of quiet research he'd done without telling her, purely so that a balcony they hadn't yet built could hold a specific, ordinary kind of magic for the rest of their lives, and felt something in her chest that had no name except the plainest one available. This is what being loved properly actually looks like. Not grand gestures. Sun charts. The rest of the house filled in around these central pieces with the same careful attention. A reading nook built into the living room's bay window, wide enough for 2 people and a shared blanket, positioned to catch the same kind of afternoon light that once fell across the floorboards of Priya's old Northcote flat. A mudroom off the garage fitted with proper racks for both their bikes and the hiking gear they'd built up over a decade of trails. A shelf near the darkroom specifically built to hold their growing collection of developed prints, framed and rotated through the seasons instead of left to gather dust in boxes. "We're basically building a museum of everything we love doing together," Priya said, looking over the final plans one evening, half laughing at how specific it all was. "That's exactly what we're building," Sushant agreed, entirely serious under the humor. "I don't want a house that just holds our stuff. I want one that holds our actual life, every hobby, every shared evening, every reason we're happy. If a room doesn't earn its place by supporting something we actually love, it doesn't go in the plans." The build took just over a year, slower than either of them wanted, faster than either had feared, full of the usual frustrations of any big construction project, weather delays and a dispute with the builder that briefly, but usefully, tested the same honest conflict skills they'd built over years of travel and business partnership. They visited the site every weekend it progressed, watching the frame go up, then the roof, then the slow interior work that finally, one spring afternoon almost exactly a year after groundbreaking, produced a finished house standing empty and complete on land Priya had personally certified as sound. They stood in the empty master bedroom on the final walkthrough. Before a single piece of furniture had arrived, the balcony doors opened to a Bellarine evening turning gold exactly as Sushant's charts had promised, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, simply standing together in the quiet enormity of having built, piece by piece and choice by choice, an actual home. "We did this," Priya said finally. "We did this," Sushant agreed. "Slowly. Correctly. On purpose. The only way we've ever done anything." The dispute with the builder, 3 months earlier, had tested them more than either liked to admit at the time, a rendering mistake on the west wall that the builder wanted to charge them to fix, even though the fault was clearly his own. Sushant, with his systems training, went through the contract line by line, calm and precise, while Priya, drawing on years of standing her ground with doubtful council members, sat across from the builder and simply refused to be talked in circles. "You were terrifying in that meeting," Sushant told her afterward, half laughing, half genuinely impressed, as they drove home having won the argument clearly. "I almost felt sorry for him." "Almost," Priya said. "Not quite," he agreed. "He tried to fix his own mistake by charging us for it. I don't feel sorry for people who do that." He glanced at her, warmth in his voice. "I like watching you fight for something that's ours. It's a different kind of fighting than fighting for a client. This one's personal, and you didn't flinch." "Neither did you," she said. "You had that contract memorized before we even walked in." "We're a good team," he said simply and reached for her hand at the next red light, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. Chapter 9. The House with a View of the Moon. They moved in on a Saturday in early autumn, 6 years almost to the week since the afternoon in Geelong when Sushant had first seen Priya's sketchbook open on a project table and understood, with the calm certainty that defined him, that he had just met someone worth paying attention to for the rest of his life. The housewarming puja was Meenakshi's idea, gently pushed for over several months of phone calls, and both of them agreed readily because it mattered to both their families in different ways. A blessing on the house, yes, but also unspoken and completely understood by everyone there, a public, joyful recognition of a partnership that had never needed a wedding to be seen as completely real. The house filled, that Saturday, with nearly 80 people, Priya's parents and Lakshmi and a wide circle of cousins, Sushant's mother flown in from Delhi for the occasion, looking, Priya thought, quietly delighted in a way that suggested whatever doubts she once carried about her son's unconventional life had long since settled into simple happiness for him. Anita and half of Groundwork's small team came too, along with the reading group friends and neighbors from both their old homes who had become, over the years, real friends rather than just people living nearby. The priest performed the puja in the new kitchen, marigolds and incense, and the warm chaos of a house being properly welcomed into its first use. Throughout the ceremony, Priya watched her mother and Sushant's mother sitting side by side, talking easily, two women from different countries and different generations who had somehow, over the slow work of years, become genuinely fond of each other, brought together by nothing more complicated than watching their children build something that plainly, undeniably worked. "I never thought I'd see this," Meenakshi told Priya quietly during a lull in the afternoon, watching the garden fill with laughing guests. "Not the house. I mean this," she gestured, taking in the whole scene, the mixed families, the easy warmth. "I thought love without marriage would always feel like something borrowed, something waiting to be made official. I don't feel that watching you today. I feel like I'm watching two people who were married the moment they decided to stop disappearing for each other. The ceremony was never going to be the thing that made it real. You made it real, 5 years ago, one Tuesday at a time." Priya held her mother's hand, her throat tight, and didn't trust herself to answer in words, so she simply held on, and her mother understood completely, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Later, as the afternoon lights softened toward evening, Sushant stood on the back steps overlooking the garden and asked, without any warning, for everyone's attention, something so unlike a man who usually avoided public sentiment that Priya felt her whole chest tighten before he'd even said a word. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, and the small crowd laughed warmly, because everyone there already knew this about him. "I'm better with buildings than with rooms full of people. But I wanted to say one thing properly, out loud, in front of everyone who matters to us, instead of only ever saying it quietly at our own kitchen table. He found Priya's eyes across the garden. 6 years ago, I was a man who had learned to make himself small just to survive a house. Priya taught me, patiently, without ever once demanding it, how to take up space again. This house isn't just brick and good drainage and a balcony angled toward the moon, though it is also that very much on purpose. It's proof that two people can build an entire life on honesty instead of obligation, and have it hold. I didn't think that was possible for me. I know now it was only ever waiting for the right person to build it with. He raised his glass slightly. To Priya, and to everyone here who never once made either of us feel strange for building this our own way. The garden erupted into warm applause, her father wiping his eyes unashamed, Lakshmi reaching for Priya's hand, and Priya crossed the space between them without waiting for the moment to finish, kissing him in front of all 80 guests, something neither of them had ever done so publicly before, feeling in that kiss the full, unguarded weight of 6 years finally spoken aloud instead of only lived. Anita found her afterward, near the drinks table, both of them a little teary, a little laughing about it. I've watched a lot of couples over the years, Anita said. Colleagues, friends, my own marriage, and its ending. I don't think I've ever watched two people build something this deliberately honest. You didn't get lucky, Priya. You worked for every single piece of this. We did, Priya agreed. Both of us. Every year of it. That's rarer than luck, Anita said. Luck runs out. What you two built doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Priya thought about that for the rest of the evening, watching Sushant move easily between guests, refilling glasses, laughing with her father over something in the garden, entirely himself in a way the careful, guarded man she'd first met in Geelong could never have imagined becoming. Anita was right, she thought. It had never been luck. It had been 6 years of choosing, on purpose, again and again, to keep building rather than settle for what had already been built. The party wound down slowly through the evening, guests drifting home in 2s and 3s, reluctant to leave because they genuinely enjoyed themselves, until finally, past 10, the house stood empty again, not with the hollow emptiness of an unfinished build, but the full, settled emptiness of a home that had just been properly, joyfully lived in for the first time. They cleaned up together, unhurried, moving through the rooms, collecting glasses and folding chairs, marigold petals from the puja still scattered across the kitchen floor. By the time the last of it was done, both of them were tired in that particular, satisfied way that follows a day that mattered. Balcony, Sushant said, holding out his hand. They climbed the stairs together and stepped out into a clear autumn night, exactly as his charts had promised 5 months earlier, standing in an empty room with no furniture at all, the last gold light gone from the west, and rising in the east, clearing the line of trees exactly as calculated, a full moon, huge and silver, climbing steadily into a sky gone the deep blue that only comes after a long, warm day. Chapter 10. Under one blanket. They brought the good blanket outside, the same soft blue throw that had once covered Priya's shoulders on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, years earlier, when Sushant had sat by a bay window watching her sleep and understood, for the first time, what safety actually felt like. They settled together into the wide outdoor seat he'd had built specifically for this moment, this view, angled precisely toward the path of the rising moon. Priya made coffee, the way she always had, unhurried, and brought 2 cups out. They sat together, the blanket pulled over both their laps, her legs across his arm around her shoulders, the whole enormous, ordinary, hard-won weight of the day finally settling into something that felt, unmistakably, like rest. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The moon climbed steadily, calm and beautiful, exactly as it had climbed the night they watched it from a fallen log at Sealer's Cove, exactly as it had climbed over every ordinary evening of the 5 years between that night and this one. Priya found herself thinking, without sadness, of everyone she had once been. The woman disappearing in a Richmond flat that looked like happiness in photos, the woman learning to breathe again in this same Northcote Bay window, the woman crouched in sand beside a broken-down boat shed watching an idea take its first shape, all of them present, somehow, in this one settled, complete version of herself, sitting under a blanket with a man who had never once, in 5 years, asked her to be smaller than she actually was. Sushant, beside her, was thinking something almost identical, of the careful, watchful man he'd been in another marriage, checking rooms for trouble before he dared speak in them, and the man he had slowly, patiently become instead, capable now of sitting in complete silence beside someone he loved without needing to manage it, without bracing for a blow that had simply, finally, stopped coming. They didn't say any of this out loud. There was no need. 5 years of practice had taught them exactly when words were necessary and when they only got in the way of something already completely understood. Do you ever think about how close we came to not doing any of this? Priya asked quietly, after a long while, her voice barely above the sound of the wind moving through the garden below. If I hadn't ended up on that project in Geelong, if you'd stayed quiet instead of telling me I mattered. I think about it sometimes, Sushant admitted. Not with fear anymore, just with a kind of wonder. How much of a life gets built on a handful of small, ordinary choices that could so easily have gone differently? He pressed a kiss into her hair. I don't really believe in fate. I believe in paying attention. I paid attention to you, that first day, because something in me recognized someone worth noticing. Everything after that was just the two of us choosing, over and over, not to look away. I'm glad neither of us looked away. So am I, he said. More than I have words for, even now. She tilted her head up to look at him, the moonlight catching the familiar lines of his face, 5 years more settled than the man she'd first met across a project table, 5 years happier, 5 years more entirely himself. No regrets? She asked, half teasing, half genuinely wanting to hear him say it. Not one, he said, without hesitation. Not the divorce. Not the years alone before you. Not even the hard parts of these last 5. All of it brought me here, to this exact balcony, with this exact woman, watching this exact moon. I wouldn't trade a single difficult year for a faster route to this. Neither would I, Priya said, and meant it completely. The 6 years with Rohan that had taught her, at a hard cost, exactly what she would never accept again. The frightened, hopeful woman who had shown up at a project office in Geelong not yet knowing she was about to be truly seen for the first time in a decade. Every one of the small, ordinary Tuesdays that had built patiently into this. They sat quietly again after that, the conversation settling the way conversations do between two people with nothing left to prove to each other. Priya rested her head against his chest and felt, beneath the wool of his sweater, the steady, unhurried rhythm of his heartbeat, the same patient rhythm that had, across 5 years, matched itself so completely to her own that she could no longer fully tell it apart from the sound of her own pulse. Two systems that had learned, slowly and without ever forcing it, to beat in the same unhurried time. Do you ever think about how close we came to not doing any of this? She had asked him. He felt her breathing settle against him, slow and easy, and understood, without needing to check, that she had arrived at the exact same place he had. Not an ending, not some dramatic final resolution, but simply a continuing. The next ordinary, extraordinary evening in a life built entirely on purpose, out of thousands of ordinary evenings just like it, chosen freely, every single one, by two whole people who had already done the harder work long before this balcony, long before this house, of learning exactly how to stay. The moon cleared the last of the trees and hung, full and silver, directly ahead of them, and neither Priya nor Sushant reached for their phones, or spoke, or did anything at all except sit together beneath one blanket, warm and unhurried, watching it rise. 5 years is not the end of a story. It is simply how long it takes two whole people to stop checking whether it's safe to stay and start, instead, simply staying. They built no blueprint. They needed none. They built a business from a broken-down boat shed, a year from 2 divided travel plans, a house from sun charts and moon paths, and a love from nothing grander than showing up, again and again, on the ordinary days as much as the extraordinary ones. This is not a fairy tale. It is something better. Two people, wide awake, choosing each other on purpose, under one blanket, beneath one rising moon, with absolutely nothing left to prove, and nowhere else they would rather be. And that brings us to the end of Two Compasses, One Direction. Thank you so much for listening, and for spending this time with Priya and Sushant's story here on Emavira Audiobooks. If it moved something in you, or reminded you of your own compass finding its direction, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below.